In October 1998, the police in Blackwood, Indiana, were called to the apartment of Sarah Collins. She hadn't shown up for work in 3 days, and her neighbors hadn't heard a sound from her unit since Monday. Inside, everything looked untouched. The television was still humming in the living room, and a cup of coffee sat on the kitchen table, long since gone cold. Officers found Sarah in her bedroom. The coroner determined the cause of death was cardiac arrest, but the circumstances were baffling. There were no drugs in her system, no signs of forced entry, and no evidence of a struggle. What stayed with the investigators, however, was her expression. Her face was locked in a wide, rigid smile that looked entirely forced. Without any signs of physical trauma or poison, the medical examiner was forced to consider a rare possibility. Sarah Collins's heart had stopped from a massive, sudden surge of terror. Over the next 6 months, the mystery grew. 5 more victims were discovered in different neighborhoods across Blackwood. They were men and women of varying ages, with no clear social or professional ties to one another. Despite the lack of a personal connection, the crime scenes were identical. Every victim was found alone in their home with the front door unlocked, and every body was found with that same frozen smile. The town descended into a state of high alert. Gun sales surged, and by sunset, the streets of Blackwood were usually empty as families retreated behind newly installed deadbolts. Detectives eventually found a common link in the victims' phone records. Each person had received a call from an unregistered number shortly before they were estimated to have died. One victim's answering machine captured the only evidence of the killer's voice. It was a low, calm whisper that said only, "Look behind you." The police realized their suspect wasn't using a conventional weapon. He was finding people when they were most vulnerable and using a single psychological trigger to induce a fatal physical shock. The investigation finally got a break when police found Emily Harper. The 22-year-old student was unconscious but alive when officers reached her apartment, making her the first person to ever survive an encounter with the smiling killer. Emily told detectives that her phone rang at midnight. A man calmly asked if she was alone, then immediately whispered the signature command to look behind her. When she looked back toward her window, she saw him. A man stood under a street lamp outside, perfectly still, watching her with a fixed grin. Moments later, the power to her apartment was cut. Emily stood in total darkness as she heard the sound of her own front door opening, followed by slow, heavy footsteps moving across the hardwood floor. The footsteps stopped inches away from her, then a voice right beside her ear whispered a single word: "Smile." The killer had refined a method of sensory deprivation and psychological pressure. By cornering his victims in the dark after a period of intense observation, he was pushing the human nervous system to a breaking point. Based on Emily's description, detectives searched the state psychiatric archives. They found a match: a former patient named Daniel Reeves. Reeves had been committed to Blackwood State Hospital years earlier. His records described him as a man of high intelligence who had become obsessed with the limits of human fear. Reeves believed a person's true face was only revealed in absolute terror, and societal norms were masks that fear stripped away. Doctors noted that Reeves had a strange physiological quirk. While most people grimace or cry when panicked, Reeves would involuntarily smile whenever he witnessed someone else in a state of terror. State records, however, showed that Daniel Reeves had died in 1996. He was listed among the casualties of a fire that had leveled the Blackwood State Hospital 2 years before the murders began. When investigators revisited the 1996 autopsy files, they found that the remains attributed to Reeves had never been verified through DNA or dental records. The body was simply assigned his name based on where it was found in the ruins. The smiling killer wasn't a ghost. He was a man who had used a hospital fire to erase his existence, allowing him to conduct his lethal psychological experiments in total anonymity. The identification of Reeves turned the investigation into a massive manhunt. The FBI moved in, and the town of Blackwood was placed under a strict military-style lockdown. Reeves eventually made a mistake, or perhaps a deliberate choice. He placed a phone call to the home of the lead investigator, Detective Marcus Hale. Hale turned to see a man smiling at him from the street. This time, police were able to trace the signal to a specific location, an abandoned farmhouse on the edge of town. SWAT teams moved in at dawn, surrounding the farmhouse and breaching the doors, with the expectation of a violent standoff. Inside, they found the walls covered in photographs. They weren't just pictures of the victims, but of dozens of people in Blackwood, all photographed through their windows while they were asleep. Reeves was gone, but he left a final message painted on the wall. It read, "Fear makes people honest." There were never any arrests. Daniel Reeves vanished after the raid, and no confirmed sightings have been reported since. But in Blackwood, the late-night phone calls never entirely stopped. Reeves may have disappeared, but he left the town with a permanent change in behavior. He demonstrated that even without a physical attack, the mere suggestion of a smiling man standing behind you can change